Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Russian President Vladimir Putin has just delivered his annual presidential address to the Federal Assembly. This address is the 23rd in the recent history of Russia and the 13th for Putin himself. Despite Russia's economic difficulties, polls continue to show wide popular confidence in the Russian leader. Today, we'll take a closer look at Russia's ongoing domestic challenges and new opportunities that may be coming in the foreign policy options. I'm happy to be joined in the first part in the studio by Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar from Tsinghua University, and we'll talk to Pavel Falkenhor, defense analyst in Russia, via satellite. In the second half, we'll be joined by Yang Xiyu, senior fellow of the China Institute of International Studies. So stay with us.
While Russia's GDP has been dropping year on year, President Putin's approval rating still remains at a record high. Donald Trump says U.S.-Russia relations have to be straightened out. But is the new White House ready to work with Putin on resolving their conflicts? With both presidential frontrunners ready to lift sanctions, will the French presidential election mark a European shift toward Russia? And as Russia continues to pivot to the east, how is it likely to handle its delicate relations with China, Japan, and India?
Well, Rick, economy of Russia was pretty bad in the first 3 quarters, but how could Putin still enjoy enormous popularity of up to 82% of the approval rating? What do you think are the fundamental reasons?
Well, you're right. The economy has been terrible in Russia, and it's going the wrong direction. But he remains immensely powerful because he is looked at as a very strong leader who is holding Russia together against international aggression. I mean, his rhetoric has been very anti-Western. He has invoked the sanctions that came after Russia took Crimea and then sent military people into Ukraine, and it has worked. And in a lot of ways, he has been a more effective political leader than President Obama in the United States. His popularity exceeds 80%. Barack Obama is considered very popular in the United States. His popularity is about 55%. The economy in the United States is relatively good, but the United States changed parties. The economy in Russia is bad, but Putin remains very strong politically, and I would expect him to easily win another term.
Pavel, is it true that President Putin has been able to use the adversity of the economic situation to his advantage and arouse the nationalist sentiment in the Duma speech?
Well, you should understand the very specific role of a Russian leader, a Russian president. He is not like an American president. And our leaders, they represent there the symbol of Russia. Of Russian unity, of Russian nationalism, and Russian statehood. And so if you compare, you should most likely ask Americans, do they support the flag and the Constitution? And you also get over 80%. And so Putin is a national unification figure. And he has been playing that hand very well under Western pressure over Crimea, over Syria, over Donbass, Western sanctions. Under foreign pressure, the Russians rallied around, or at least a large part of the Russian population rallied around the Kremlin, rallied around Putin, because the question is not that you're for Putin or for someone else, but are you for Putin and Russia, or you're for America and Obama? And in Russia, of course, the vast majority says they're for Russia.
It doesn't come as a surprise, Pavel and Rick, for us to see the father figure of a certain country in the wake of a major disaster. For example, President Bush appeared on ground zero in the wake of 9/11, and this time around, with months of economic sanctions and the economic decline, President Putin came across as yet another wartime leader to rally the whole country behind him. Now, how does the Russian democracy work and function in your country at this moment? Do you have a serious Duma or National Congress?
Well, the Russian, it's not really much of a democracy. It's a kind of a more authoritarian state. The Kremlin, the ruling United Russia Party, have a constitutional majority in the Duma. It is basically a rubber stamp that just approves what the Kremlin wants. Its opposition, of course, in Russia exists, but it's not very vocal, and it doesn't have a very serious influence on on the decision-making process at all.
Well, Pavel seems to be the democracy in Russia, calling Duma a rubber stamp. That's something that the Western media uses in describing National People's Congress, our top legislature here. But United Russia, the ruling party, has up to 450 seats. 342 seats out of 450. A remote second would be the Communist Party of Russia, which has 42 seats, and the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, 39. What do you think of the Russian democracy?
Well, Putin has won fair and square. I mean, he has a majority supporting him. It technically would be true. This is a rubber stamp legislature because he has such an overwhelming majority that anything he wants would be approved. I also don't think that there is clearly not a free and open press by global standards in Russia. There's been a lot of intimidation of opposition, and both reporters and political opponents have been killed. But I mean, that having been said, there are the trappings of democracy, much like in Iran, where you have elections, and Putin would win whether you have a rigged election or a not rigged election. Pavel identified the reasons.
Pavel, what do you think of his comments on the China-Russia relationship in his speech?
Well, Putin very strongly spoke about the very strong strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing, and it is going to develop further, and it's very important for the future and the security in Eurasia and the Asia-Pacific region. At the same time, he actually said that Russia will have a very strong partnership with India, hopes to have a much closer relationship with Japan, and he didn't mention that, but that's implied. We do have a very close partnership with Vietnam. So Russian policy in Asia, I would say, is going to be to some extent balanced, though China, of course, comes first. No question.
Thank you very much, Pavel and Enrique, for being with us. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Mr. Yang Xiyu, a Senior Research Fellow with the China Institute of International Studies. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. In the first part of our program, both Rick and Pavel have been very critical of the presidency of Putin, says he's very tough on the opposition in domestic politics, and he used the economic woes as a driving force to rally the whole country behind him, because after all, he enjoys up to 82% of the approval rating. However, since the Ukraine crisis and the Crimea in particular, and after Russia was ousted from G7, China, do you believe China came in just in time to assist President Putin to survive the economic crisis, and therefore the strategic partnership between the two countries has been reinforced effectively to counterbalance the back to Asia strategy of the Obama administration?
Well, partly you're right. China, Russia getting much more closer in recent years, but the driving reason does not lie in the Western pressures. Basically, from the mutual benefits, both Russia and China needs each other, and that is the fundamental reason. Of course, during this process, U.S. play a very interesting role. Say, putting China and Russia getting together. That is the outsider factor, but the decisive factor come from the domestic both of the domestic reasons in Beijing and Moscow.
Let's take a closer look at the domestic reasons for President Putin to enjoy such tremendous popularity, and West would call it the populist charisma of Putin's presidency. But Pavel, during the presidency of Medvedev, who is currently the premier, he talked about the modernization of the Russian economy, but a little seems to have been achieved, and the reset policy also failed. What do you think of the most likely moves and policy options to be adopted by President Putin to show up the economy itself, which of course lays the groundwork for whatever power?
In today's address, Putin was emphasizing that there should be some, at least though maybe measured, deregulation, allowing Russians and Russian entrepreneurs to have more initiative in and the state getting off their back, and also, of course, decreasing corruption. And Putin specifically singled out two fields where there is significant growth. That's agriculture and defense industry, which both have about, there was a bumper harvest this year in 2016, and the defense industry enjoys a growth of more than 10% and also productivity growth. And he was saying that, of course, that very much depends on the Russian budget spending very large sums on rearmament and procuring new weapons. Putin said that now we should work on moving that expertise into the IT industry, and in general kind of moving progress in defense industry into civilian industry. Again, that's going to be quite an uphill task in today's world, but that is also a kind of traditional Soviet way. First you invest in defense, and then you cut the know-how further on. And of course, agriculture, we spoke a lot of having more progress in producing food.
You've been lashing out against President Putin for spending too much on the military industry, but what about the social security program? To my knowledge, up to 70% of the budget went to the improvement of well-being of the retirees, the old, the pensioners, and that's part of the reason for his enormous popularity. Is that true?
Well, actually, it happened some years ago when Russia was very rich with petrodollars and oil cost over $100 a barrel. There were very drastic increases in pensions for retirees, for military pensioners, and social welfare. In the last several years, there has been much less money available, and there have been very limited inflation adjustments for pensioners and for actually military personnel too. But that did not reflect on Putin's approval ratings. Specifically thanked the Russian people today, Putin, that under economic duress they are still patriotic, and the nation is united in supporting the Kremlin politically.
Well, there has been myth about the strength of Russia. On the ground that this nation is always obsessed with the fears that the vast territory may cause more troubles than bring about a sense of security. And therefore there should be strong needs for the military build-up to guarantee 100% security. But George Kennan, the first very senior and influential American diplomat in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, said in his cable to the Secretary of, to the State Department of Washington that the absolute security of one country means the absolute insecurity of other countries. Is that still the case for Russia?
Well, at least in the European arena, that remains the case. Say, any security efforts between NATO and Russia, any security efforts by one side means increasing security for this side, but a reduction of security for the other. So that is the zero-sum game stemming from the Cold War. Now I cannot say such a game has been terminated, remain going on.
Now, yet another major concern of Moscow with regard to the European security mechanism is that Russia has never been included in any regular security mechanism since the end of the Cold War, following the ouster from G7. Russia says its voice has been marginalized by the Russian neighbors, and they call for perhaps the construction of yet another Yalta conference to rediscuss the regional security mechanism. Will that be a realistic goal?
Well, it's very, I should say it's a realistic goal, but it's really hard to be achieved. Now,
with the campaign success of Donald Trump, the president-elect, do you think there's a chance for Putin to bring about rapprochement with the United States, and economic sanctions will hopefully be lifted by a country like France in the next year, because there will be a major election there, and both candidates, Marine Le Pen and François Fillon, called for lifting the economic sanctions against Russia?
Well, that's a really hard question, but with a big question mark. In my observation, the chance for improvement of the Russian-US relation is pretty high. However, the improvement will only be limited within the atmosphere, the state of the bilateral relation, but in the core of the Russia-US relation will not be changed because of the core of the competition, even confrontation on strategic level will not be changed simply because of two reasons. Number one, the anti-missile systems. No matter how hot or warm President Trump take towards Russia, I don't believe Trump will make a decision, say, withdraw the anti-missile system in Europe. And the other reason is the existing sanction measures on Russia, jointly made by European and United States. And I don't believe President Trump will be able to remove all of the sanction measures, maybe some of them, that all of the sanction measures will not be removed. So in short period, because of the two reasons, I don't believe Russia and the US bilateral relation will be improved substantively.
Rick, yet another major issue of great concern for Russia is whether Georgia and Ukraine, which used to be member states of the Commonwealth of Independence, would be members of the NATO. If this threat is to be removed, and then President Putin will stand ready to have a serious dialogue with NATO and perhaps with other geopolitical competitors.
I do think that the election of Donald Trump is an important signal in this case, both with Georgia and with Ukraine. I think it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for NATO to expand to include them. I also would include Finland. There has been some support inside of Finland for Finland joining NATO as an umbrella of protection against possible Russian incursion. I think that Donald Trump will rethink the relationship. I agree he's not going to radically shift it. We won't see an end of sanctions. We won't see an end of the missiles. But I think this is an opportunity for President Putin, if he has a realistic agenda for reshaping the European security situation, for him to make progress.
Pavel, did you see any early signs of a buddy-buddy between this president-elect Donald Trump and President Putin, since Moscow was accused by the United States of exercising influence in an effort to shape the process and orientation of the presidential race through cyber espionage or whatever hackers attack. So what do you think of the chance for a relationship between Moscow and Washington to be seriously improved during the presidency of Donald Trump?
Well, it was clear during the American election campaign that a large portion of the Russian ruling elite was rooting for Donald Trump. opposed to Hillary Clinton, who would be most likely very anti-Russian as seen here from Moscow. But that does not mean that we'll actually have a very serious or long-lasting rapprochement between Washington and Moscow now when Trump takes over as president. In today's speech, Putin spoke very guardedly about Russia's desire to have better relations, but not so much optimism in his voice. And it's also a fact that here in Moscow there are very powerful and influential forces that don't want actually to see much closeness between Moscow and Washington. Well, I mean the military, the defense industry, because that would mean defense budgets would be slashed, and that's the last thing they want. So Putin was Rick, optimistic on finding better ways to Europe to
thank you, Pavel. Thank you.
Reform a Eurasian security system.
Rick, what do you think of the military advance that President Putin has been able to make in Aleppo, a major city in Syria, during the transitional period between Obama and Donald Trump?
I think this is significant. I think that he saw it as an opportunity. By the time Donald Trump is in office, he would like to see Aleppo in completely in government hands. They've made some progress, but this has been very bloody, very slow, very controversial. But I think it is significant because the United States was trying to come at Raqqa, the capital, de facto capital of the Islamic State, from Iraq, and there's sort of a race to Raqqa. Right now, Russia is moving ahead. The with American advisors, the Syrian forces, the Iraqi forces are bogged down, making slow progress. Russia is now making faster progress in Aleppo.
President-elect Donald Trump said recently that he has a different understanding about Syria. Will that be the beginning of a rapprochement between Moscow and Washington? Will that be a turning point for the bilateral relationship?
Yeah, I think that will be a turning point, as you mentioned, for the improving of. In other words, U.S. and Russia can make a deal. Trump is a business-style president. The two sides, the two presidents, the two governments can make a deal on some third-party issues like Syria and even Ukraine. But in the matters, in the bilateral relation, it's very hard to make a deal like anti-missile systems and some others. Furthermore, I'm afraid there could be a sort of arms race going on because Putin has made a lot of inputs for military build-ups, as we mentioned earlier, and Trump will turn the trends of the United States to increase rather than continue to reduce the military budget. So after the 7 years reduction of our military budget by the United States, we will see the uphill increasing of the military budget. So both of the big countries are increasing their military inputs, and a sort of military arms races is coming. That's what I'm concerned.
Rick, what do you think of the chance for President Putin to make his own way back to the center, given the powerful mandate in his hand? Because he enjoys 82% of the approval rating, and that'll be an awesome mandate in his hand.
I expect that he will have a mandate. I also expect that you will see him be much more aggressive internationally, and what he is doing in India and Japan are two examples. He likes to keep other countries off balance, whether they're friends or foes, and by his rapprochement with Japan and his rapprochement with India, he keeps pressure on China, which is a very close ally of Pakistan. And so I think you're going to see a very active Putin in the world, and Syria and the Middle East, he will have had a major victory there, and I think you'll continue to see Russian influence in that region as well. So I think he will use his power to expand Russian influence.
Before we wrap up this very interesting discussion about the State of the Union speech by President Putin in the Duma, Pavel, let me ask you very quickly. We have long been so interested in your command of, the international chess. What is the most interesting myth about your skills in manipulating the international chess? Because President Putin is said to be a master in, playing the chess.
Well, Russia is the nation of chess, not the nation of poker. And Russian elites have been traditionally very good in pre-planned, well worked out operations and hate to work on kind of off the line, improvise. The Russians are not good in improvising, but good in pre-planning. And many Russian moves are very brilliant if they were thought through and pre-planned. It happened in Syria and in Crimea and many other, in Georgia and many other places.
What do you think of the master of international chess in its application to Putin's diplomacy?
I think the records has shown the very excellent wisdom of diplomacy by Russia on varied issues, especially on the Syria issue during the past years. So I believe we will see bigger changes in that area because Trump will probably adjust American policy there. So there will be more cooperation. That means more chess between U.S. China on Syria and the Middle East as a whole. So during the game, I believe Russians' techniques and strategic thinkings will take the advantages.
Rick, do you think President Putin is likely to get closer to the center stage of international politics?
I do, and in a positive way in the Middle East influence, in a more complicated way in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe.
Well, thank you very much for your insightful discussion about the State of the Union speech by President Putin in Duma, which is the National Assembly of Russia. And despite the economic woes, he still enjoys enormous influence and popularity at home. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.